For our stage, Jennifer Georgino.
Thank you, Stephen. That was very kind. And first, I wanted to thank Jennifer for inviting me to this prestigious event, which is just going to be too much fun. There's an awful lot. You can tell I'm a Yankee, so I'm going to talk fast. And I hope Manny does too, because he's a fellow Yankee as well. There's an awful lot to discuss in this category, whether it's legal implications, whether it's definitions, interoperability, which one of my panelists is very versed in, as well as SEC and issues that Joonho will address as well. So I'm going to introduce them shortly. They've all three gone to many schools and have high academics behind them, so I want to explain their background and honor that for their parents, if anything. And we'll introduce them shortly. I wanted to make just a couple remarks myself, and similar to Ted, I wanted to kind of lay a bit of the groundwork just with opening remarks. So what I call the beauty of blockchain involves some of the characteristics, I don't know what that is, but okay. Some of the characteristics of blockchain that I find and call the beauty of blockchain. So what one has been obviously mentioned with Ted spoke, and that was immutability, which is highly regarded as one of the more important issues around blockchain. Immutability, the consensus then, typically in a private blockchain, of course, the consensus amongst the nodes. And I'm going to assume some of you have some level of understanding of blockchain in that space. The fighting of fraud is huge, and when we get into legal issues and regulatory, that's one aspect. I know when I was with a small startup in the healthcare space wanting to apply blockchain last year, we were questioning whether we should be called a cybersecurity startup, because that's what blockchain was attacking, and initially that was the idea, was it was so powerful, so strong, so secure, or more secure than anything we've ever had, any database, what have you, that really it was touted in early 2017, early last year, as really something to help fight cybersecurity, indeed. And then the issue of provenance, which is a French word, of course, that everyone knows, that lets you do all the auditing, the traceability, the transparency to make sure there is that security that, again, we don't have, and that is so vital when it comes to healthcare records. Transactions as well is the low-hanging fruit in healthcare is pretty much pharmaceutical, supply chain, as well as the transactions. That is the transactions in payments and transactions as they occur with the payors. I'm going to bring up and ask our panelists to come up so I can introduce them, please. All righty, we first have, ladies first, is Dana. Dana Attar was formerly a director at Cerner, an EHR company. She is therefore quite familiar and versed in the issues around patient records and interoperability in particular. As an advocate of innovation, she is an advisor to early-stage startups and currently serves on the advisory board of the tech incubator at Queens College. She has an MBA from MIT. Next is Joonho Lee. Joonho is a general partner of Cryptoconomy. This is company, a consulting firm specializing in AI, crypto technology, blockchain, and cybersecurity. Prior to this company, he was the head of strategy and operations at the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco. Prior to that, he was the CIO and senior vice president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Joonho received an MS and MBA from Rensselaer and has a JD from NYU. His undergrad was in computer engineering. He also owns several patents, which to me, the IP world, I was a former paralegal at Coca-Cola and legal manager at British Telecom, so the idea that he has patents is quite formidable on his own. He will be closing our keynote later today, and we hope by then we'll have looked at all the challenges of the day and be able to have some bright light at the end of the day looking to our future, right? Lastly but not least is Manny Alicandro. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Yes. Alicandro. Manny is an attorney and published author with broad experience in compliance, regulation, and governance. Governance being, of course, an issue initially came up with Ted talking as well, in compliance. He has held diverse roles from banking to trading technology. He has an MS from PACE, MBA from MIT as well, and a law degree from NYU. If you'll welcome my panelists, please. Our question for the day is, how does regulation actually affect blockchain technology when we're talking about the healthcare space? We're looking at, and this came up again in the keynote, the issue of the patient owning their own records, right? So it's not only, and I love Shada's comment that we're global patients. That is so true. And with the crypto world, we are global individuals. We are global citizens, is of course what Bitcoin and the whole crypto world likes to bring around to us, right? But the idea of being a global patient is a very, very difficult thing to manage, right? We all know that it's been over 12 years since President Obama, thank God, pulled the healthcare industry as the last industry in the United States down the digital pike. Pulled it kicking and screaming. And I will argue it is still kicking and screaming, right? We're not there. And of course, we're in the nascent stage of blockchain technology in healthcare, but there is a lot happening. If I've learned anything in going and attending many seminars, many conferences, it's that there is so much happening behind the scenes and otherwise. It will take time, people must be patient, but I honestly believe, and this is separate from what crypto you're buying at this moment and how that will go up or down, but I honestly believe blockchain technology is like a freight train, is the only thing I can relate it to. It is coming, it is passing you, and it's going to happen, and it is happening, and it is the future, and it's Internet 2.0 or whatever you want to call it. But it takes us back to when we all just learned of the internet. It's that revolutionary. I do believe, as Ted said, that it is not to be slapped on everything, right? IBM will even tell you that with Hyperledger. But for that particular problem that is out there, especially in healthcare, that requires the unique solution of blockchain, it's a beautiful thing. So that's enough of my proselytizing of blockchain technology. I'm going to ask Manny to start us off. So this is a nascent technology. Regulators are having an issue with it. And of course, there's a lot of startups in the room. We're in a facility that's going to have a lot of startups. Tell us what is going on with the laws, the regulations that have already maybe been finalized, and what are the challenges we're now in the middle of this regulatory environment?
Sure, great. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I like coming back to Cambridge. As was mentioned, I wrapped up my MBA earlier this year from MIT, and Dana was my classmate. So always happy to come back to Cambridge and get invigorated by the level of academia here and people's interests in really interesting topics. So I'm an attorney. I have my own practice in New York. And effectively, I work on capital markets issues and matters, but I focus a lot on blockchain. And what's most interesting about my practice is that every day, essentially, people come to me with different projects. Some are healthcare, some are in different spaces. Some people want to do a securities token offering for art, for example, or real estate. They want to create inherent liquidity in a market that has no liquidity. What's common amongst all the projects is the fact that the regulatory landscape is very complicated. Because in the US, we have federal regulation, we have state regulation. In particular, the projects that people come to me with in terms of doing ICOs and securities token offerings, STOs, which we'll talk about later on in more detail, also involve a global perspective. Many people want to do an ICO, for example, in Malta or Gibraltar. So not only am I dealing with federal regulation in the US, which could be Securities and Exchange Commission or Commodities Futures Trading Commission, SEC and CFTC, you also have each of the states. Some of the states, like New York, for example, the Division of Financial Services, they have a New York BIT license. So they have much more stringent requirements in terms of dealing with virtual currency in New York. And if you're residing in New York or a business in New York, you have a customer in New York. So it's an interesting analysis that needs to be done where you have to take into account where am I located, who am I dealing with, and what do I want to do. What's most interesting to me about healthcare is the fact that when you look at privacy and you look at data, you really can't be separated, right? We have issues in this country with regard to maintenance of individual privacy. So you can look at Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. you can look at Google, right? So the other day, I went to a doctor. I had a physical, and I Googled that doctor's address, and then in my Facebook feed, a promotion came up for that type of doctor. So Big Brother is there. I mean, actually, obviously, this is no surprise to anyone. But what does that mean? That means who is viewing my information, and to what extent do I own that information? So owning information and owning my own personal information is not only important for privacy reasons in terms of people not knowing things about me they don't want them to know, it's also commoditizable. So if I'm standing up here with a can of Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola can't use my image to sell Coca-Cola without paying me. That's kind of the way the law is today in terms of my image. What's my image? But I would argue that my image is much more than what I look like. My image are my medical records. Fill out my image. Medications I take, doctors I see, health issues I have, things I click on Google, things I search on, things I buy. So I'm not looking at healthcare separate from general privacy issues. So clearly, in our space right now that we're talking about, we have HIPAA, right? We have other governmental agencies, NIH, and so on and so forth, depending on how they're viewing what these blockchain projects can do. My concern is that the data needs to be aggregated to some extent, to a large extent. But nonetheless, the blockchain could provide solutions, but also could add additional problems if we don't rectify those problems. The government right now, different states have different projects, different use cases, which I think are very helpful. And I think we'll get into some of those in detail. My concern is that the framework from the federal government is not there. Usually when you have laws describe what you can do. Laws lay out the framework. What's happening in blockchain in general is the blockchain is way ahead of the regulation. So the regulation is catching up to the blockchain, or trying to catch up. Blockchain's way ahead. So how does something catch up to something else? Well, blockchain can't stop for the regulation to catch up. So it's always moving, and it's constantly moving ahead. When will you have that convergence? I don't know. I personally think that the main issues that people will face will be use of my data. Will my data, an image of me that's de-identified in terms of my name is taken off it, is that commoditizable in a certain way? Are people selling my information that I'm not aware about? Also, you mentioned earlier, which is a great point, how do you maintain this data? So something that's off the chain in terms of records, can they be hacked into? Can people want to obtain that information? Because again, the data is valuable. The usage of that data is priceless. I mean, look at how Facebook has been able to commoditize, and Google. They essentially created a business model of commoditizing people's data based upon the number of users that they have. I remember for years struggling with what is Facebook and what does Facebook do? Pretty obvious now, but it wasn't obvious to me years ago. When we have billions of users, you're able to do a lot with the data. So from a legal and regulatory perspective, I think down the road things will be challenged. Right now, as I mentioned, we have the granddaddy of it all, HIPAA. What's interesting though is that's just looking at it from a myopic perspective of the US. From a global perspective, for example, you have GDPR. What's the deal with GDPR? Well, the situation with GDPR is that not only is that my data, I also could request that my data be deleted. So now, if the blockchain is immutable, but I'm requesting that my data be deleted, how do you work that out? And how is that rectified? So we have all these novel issues that we need to explore, which is great. The problem is, if there's a major hack, if there's a major issue where people's data is compromised and stolen, most probably the government or governmental agency will find that company. My concern is that the government's not laying out the framework, laying out the lanes that these agents, that these players, blockchain projects, and various companies in the ecosystem should work within and live within the confines of that framework. If that framework's not there, which it really isn't to me right now, we're really subjecting ourselves to liability. So I think we need to work more cooperatively with the government, which is we need to engage the government.
Is this not on?
Did you hear anything I said?
It was very good, though.
So let me start again. So HIPPN. So essentially, what I was saying is that, I don't have a lot of reverb here. So essentially what I was saying was that there are big issues with the fact that we don't have clarity from a regulatory perspective and a legal perspective of the lay of the land and a framework. And how I look at regulation is regulation that should actually be effective. I don't believe in regulation that stifles innovation, that stifles industry, that's punitive. I believe in regulation that lays out a framework and a foundation that people can work within and projects can work within. But you know, in sum, my point is that I think we as an ecosystem need to engage the stakeholders. So we need to work collaboratively with the other stakeholders in this space and engage them to work with the lawmakers, right? We don't get congressional actors involved and state legislatures involved. I think, you know, we're going to be facing some challenges, and they can't really just not show up and not be a seat at the table, and then come in later and try to hit people with fines.
Thank you, Manny. Thank you very much. I'm going to next ask Joonho to explain what he's doing in this space, how he got in this space, and further to what Manny was explaining, the issue of cybersecurity has hit hospitals pretty heavily. I mean, we had WannaCry in the UK last year. I mean, in my homeland, I live in Atlanta currently, Equifax was a horrible thing to happen. I read last night where Norway had half of their population, their patient records, half of the population, it's a small country given, but half of the population of patient records were hacked. Cybersecurity is an issue that's only getting worse. Dr. Laura explained to me that an oncology medical record can be worth on the black market at least $1,500 per. They're the most important record on the black market, the most valuable, even compared to your fintech, to your financial data. So it's being pinged all the time, right? So it's a real issue. So that is your wheelhouse, talking about cybersecurity. Tell us how you got into the blockchain space and your comments with regard to healthcare, cybersecurity, and how blockchain can fit into that and help that.
So, by the way, Manny, I don't think anybody's buying your image from the web. So let me briefly talk about the cybersecurity for a second. I mean, the cybersecurity is really not new. Blockchain and cybersecurity has nothing to do with my opinion. Cybersecurity has to be there no matter what you bring in. I think there is a general concept of understanding that blockchain is secure, bullshit, because anybody here is over 18 years old, right? So I can curse. The reason is because really the blockchain, what it solved at the end of the day was a double spending problem. Anybody who read the white paper from the Nakamoto knows that that's the only thing it solved. Now that's what came out of the blockchain. But confidentiality of it, anything that goes with the integrity of it, that is still the conventional cybersecurity that is long existed. So when we implement these cybersecurity versus blockchain, we have to make it work functionally. But please do not forget there is like a rest of fundamental foundational cybersecurity work that you have to do. So I'll give a couple examples. What's the weakest link of the cybersecurity in healthcare? Top number one, if you look at actually you can probably find it in Google. It's top number 5 cybersecurity issues, and nothing is actually anything to do with cryptography. None of these cybersecurity weakest link is anything to do with blockchain, but it's actually all about people. There's no patch for people with stupidity, right? We can't come up with a solution for that. Social engineering, people are very vulnerable to somebody being very friendly. You just give out your credentials. The biggest problem that regulations are thinking about at the end of the day is not about stopping the innovation. That's not what the regulators are doing. What the regulators are trying to figure out is that the fundamental issues of how do you protect the public. So if you lose your key and you have nowhere to go, what I mean by the private keys that holds your Bitcoin, as an example, at least in the bank you can go and complain and they'll try to do it for you. Why? Because it's part of Federal Reserve law that we supervise. But in the cryptocurrency world, You got nowhere to go. You lose it, it's gone. But is that the right thing to do? You know, so there are things that issues I think Manny is kind of alluding to. There are things that we need to be careful and bring those people in, such as regulators, to figure out how can we solve those problems if, as an example, if the kids are missing. So that's really a brush stroke of cybersecurity relationship, but then it's not.
Oh, no, that's okay. And just for housekeeping, please hold your Q&A, your questions for afterwards. I hope you have questions. I think it's vital and important to ask questions. Oftentimes there's the best clarity of what's being discussed in our sort of fireside chat during the Q&A. And they'll alert me when we have enough time to indeed go to questions. But please hold those. And please don't be shy either. It's a small enough group that we can do that. I'm going to turn now to our lady on the panel. And she's obviously been in the middle with Cerner and Epic being the largest EMRs, EHR companies out there in the U.S. What was the figure they said last night when we all got together? The local partners in health, is it? That just implemented $1.7 billion Epic implementation. That's a lot of money. And they tend to keep things in silos. This is a problem that is a real issue around the interoperability. I've been a member of HIMSS now. HIMSS is the large HIT professional organization in the country, and interoperability was always an issue, period. But obviously it's becoming even more so rather than opening up. And the government is starting to get involved in that. But I would appreciate Donna letting us know how she got into this space, obviously through her employer, but her comments on the interoperability and the issue of the patient records.
Sure. So I spent the last 17 years in healthcare on the implementation side and the management side and the sales side of the different technologies that are out there. So I've seen a lot of technologies goes ups and down, and that's usually for a reason. When you implement technology, there's always three things I look for. It's the technology, people, and process. It's number one, not the other. That's why you would see a lot of successes and failure in technology. So you can have the best technology out there if you don't have the right processes design and the people to adapt to it, the technology will fail. The nice things in the nice 9 years that we've seen in healthcare technology that has really revolutionized where we're at today is the meaningful use, which is the government standards of what the electronic health record should be if you are to use that in the U.S. Now, love it or hate it, some people call it meaningless use, which I totally understand that, and I would agree with that to a certain degree. But whether you love it or hate it, what it did really, it brought our organizations in the U.S. from 2009, there was 16% of hospital and health system that actually had electronic health record to 2013, in 5 years, to 80% of them. Now, are they all usable data? There's a lot of this junk data out there. But at least it brought us really up to speed on getting the technology, and some of the benefits we see today where we're allowed to do a lot of digital health innovation is because we have that standard data that in place to build on. There's a lot of work we still need to do, but that's really just the background of where we're at. Obtain any health information from them. Even though they use Epic, and so is the probably one of the hospital across the street from them, but they don't talk to each other. So it's not a limitation of just the vendor you're using. It's also that's the choice of the politics that we do of making those options of who uses what. So it would be interesting to see where blockchain will end up, because it has a lot of opportunities, I think, for our discussions today. From a regulatory perspective, what Meaningful Use did, it brought up the industry very quickly into a standard. So we need to have a lot of electronic medical records companies out there. And when that was regulated, a lot of them dropped out of the map because it was very costly to be certified and stay in the market. And that brought the adoption very quickly as well. Would that happen in blockchain? That's, I think, yet to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. This is for the panel. So the drug market has an awful lot of fraud. And as I said, pharmaceutical is one of the areas that blockchain is going to be very helpful in. So if you can imagine, for those of you new to blockchain, that you can actually track then from the manufacturer, and I've been told, I don't know this for sure, but I've been told that, for instance, with regard to cancer, there are patients out there who are actually paying maybe $5,000 a month for a cancer drug, and when they get it, it's really sugar. So the fraud is phenomenal, and it's horrible. Dr. Leah knows this, she's shaking her head. It's really quite dangerous and pitiful in terms of cost. So what we've been told and what is intent on happening is from that manufacturer to you as an individual with blockchain technology in a private consensus of nodes, you will be able to trace that drug from the manufacturer to you as the individual. It will be able to be tracked. This is more than RFID or more than all the technology you've seen from here. It may not be tomorrow again, but it is happening. It is under development. The technology has already been there, as Joonho said, for a very long time. But it's finally happening, and this is all a good thing. But as far as pharmaceutical is concerned, what kind of regulatory implementations might you see, or implications might you see that the government may have an issue with, or is it politics, as Dana so appropriately said, and is it going to take a long time for that to come about? Any of you have any comments? Bill?
Some comments about that. So I think people kind of use the term between provenance and authenticity kind of mixed way, but it's two very different things. At the end of the day, what we are like pharmaceutical ones, what we really want to care as a patient is authentic, the medication. What I'm taking is the real medicine I'm supposed to take. What the blockchain will give you is the audit trail of a nice location of where it has been, but does it really gives me a good feeling that this is really an authentic one? So I think that's what the regulator is going to be focusing on. They were saying, okay, we got it. This is going to make it much more efficient. You got a good audit trail. You know where it come from. But let's face it. So until lunchtime, I'm going to be completely down there. So please forgive me. Right? If I'm a hacker, you know how easy it is to set up a company? Very easy. I'm going to set up a company in some place, and I'm going to make that as one of like a pharmaceutical company. I want to kind of engage a couple of doctors here and there. Boom. It's a legitimate company. I'm going to buy from the black market some of those sugar pills, and then I want to create all the records. Like I'm going to shove it in, millions of records into the blockchain. I'm going to get it ruling the world. And then people would say, consensus, yeah, that company is a legitimate one, it's a selling a good one, has an awesome trail. The fundamental issue doesn't solve, right? So I think that's, again, what the law should be there. Somehow there got to be some regulated supervision in a way so that authentic medication is provided by legitimate people. So I think that's what the law is going to focus on.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. I totally agree. I think, look, bad people are going to continue to do bad things, right? So bad actors are motivated by profit. And in a porous environment where bad actors can get away with things, they will continue to do as such. I think, unfortunately, it is kind of evil with this malintent that people would want to literally commit fraud and not, provide the proper medication to people. That's a pretty horrible individual or a company that need to be dealt with swiftly. But again, that's an enforcement mechanism, right? So what the blockchain can do is better help the enforcement agencies, the governmental agencies, in carrying out their mandate through an audit trail. So we can figure out who's doing what. But at the end of the day, again, it's us as a community to really out people and report. There has to be a level of self-reporting in any community, similar to minors in terms of gatekeepers, right? People need to be watching what's going on, and I think at the end of the day, to just say, blockchain could lead to a mitigation of this, these bad actors or bad practices. I think that might be a bit of an overreach. I think through blockchain and advancements of blockchain, the regulators and the enforcement agencies will better be able to do their job and prosecute people maybe more quickly and swiftly than they can right now. But at the end of the day, I think people will still be, involved in scams, unfortunately.
True. I was looking for Ted, and I can see him in the audience. But the smart contracts, it's my understanding, and I'm not a technologist, so I'm going to attempt to explain this. When you're in a consensus in a private, trusted blockchain, you are in a position where no one, I'm told, can hack you. Of course, Joonho could, perhaps, but, and it can happen. It hasn't yet with the blockchains that have been out there. So what happens is from hash to hash, and again, I'm not a technologist, but from node to node, the hashes are so long and require so much energy that it literally cannot happen. And then a node, the next node would not recognize if there was some sort of breach. The next node does not recognize it, it's booted out of the system. So when you have that closed private blockchain, that's what I'm talking about in terms of the protections that are there. And that's what would be in place with that pharmaceutical drug going from A to C, right? So along the path, there would be smart contracts in place. The reason I love smart contracts, I was pre-med my freshman year. Many of you probably were also, and then became doctors in the audience. I couldn't because I faced organic chemistry and physics and failed. So I didn't really fail as a C, which was failure to me because I was like 5% of my high school class. So it was like, okay, I cannot be a doctor. But what I did excel in and didn't have to study in was logic and courses like that, and foreign language, to be honest. So international studies became my degree. But logic was so appealing to me, and I think I'm methodical in my thinking, and you'll follow me as such an academic group that you are. If A plus B equals C, right? Very simply. So last year, I got involved and drank the Kool-Aid with blockchain because I heard IBM explain, and Tap Scott with his Blockchain Revolution was a keynote at an event where they were at, where he explained, okay, Jennifer, with smart contracts, it's if A and B are present, C will occur. And I just thought it was the most beautiful thing in the world. I had already been with Oracle, where BI tools, business intelligence tools were said to be just phenomenal and something new over 10 years ago. Well, now we have self-executing contracts. It's not going to replace lawyers, but literally self-executing contracts. So when all the T's and C's are there, this will happen. And I still think it's a beautiful thing. It's not here today, to Juno's point, no question, but that's the idea, and that's why it is so phenomenal and disruptive, if you will. So we were, Manny was kind to mention GDPR. Do any of you see a big impact in the United States, and are you seeing that maybe with some enterprises or larger companies you're working with around, as Dan said, the influence that that may have on companies in the U.S. and where we could go with that?
I can't speak to it from a legal perspective. I just talk about regulations overall. As you know, healthcare is a very slow to adapt to anything. I think we are the last to arrive on any new technology or new thing that comes up. I think just by point of the having something like that, blockchains and new technology that need to be, can use a lot of innovation. Generally, regulation will slow down innovation. So having somewhere in between, I think it will be interesting. Maybe not much of a regulation, but maybe guidelines to start with. That's why we'll see a lot of companies getting out of the US or the EU to actually trial these things. That's just my high-level thoughts about it. Well, you know more about the actual law.
I've done a fair amount of work, GDPR compliance with more financial services, which is a more well-developed market, and as correctly mentioned earlier, it's very time sensitive. So, people's personal information is of paramount importance. And I think GDPR is revolutionary in really clearly identifying who owns the data. It's that individual's data, and that individual should have control of that data, including, as I mentioned earlier, deleting that data. So, we kind of have laws and rules in this country in terms of the regulatory schema, I'll call, of like, waiving into things, or, we have to check a box and grant permission, and if we don't check the box, it's essentially a contract with each. If we don't check the box, we don't get that service, or, I'm not able to use my iPhone if I don't agree to their terms and conditions. I think what's interesting about GDPR is it really kind of turns the perspective, it puts the power in the hands of the individual. So I think as we continue to see further progress with regard to blockchain projects in healthcare, you will see more of a way of a convergence or compliance with GDPR for those healthcare projects. But I think it's complicated, and it's a lot more complicated in the EU than it is in the United States because of that framework. Nonetheless, I think it's important that the government here kind of steps up, maybe not to the extent of GDPR, but we need something maybe halfway in between to lay out that framework. So, as I mentioned earlier, you have the law, you have the regulation, and then you build around that or in compliance with it. Here, it's kind of the opposite. So it's interesting what will happen here, but it's also interesting if you look at it from a global perspective. If you're a global player and you have global clients, even though you're in the US, you still have to comply with GDPR. And that's the real interesting aspect of it. You can't look at it as, oh, it's in the EU, it pertains to the EU. It pertains to anybody who's dealing with the EU, who's actually in the EU at that time. So it's not only pertaining to EU citizens, it pertains to anybody who's physically in the EU at that moment in time, which is really sweeping if you think about who it encompasses. If you think about the traffic within the EU, people coming in and out of the EU, you have those protections when you step foot in the EU.
So any American company with Americans or what have you, or foreigners, must abide.
To the extent they're dealing with EU companies or people in the EU, absolutely. So it was a big transition for particularly financial services companies in terms of, what I'll call the alphabet soup of regulators in the US between federal and state regulators, and now you have global regulators. And the EU is very powerful, from an economic perspective in terms of, buyers and the buying power of the individuals in the EU. So, yeah, it was a difficult, mountain to climb for US institutions who have global presence and presence in the EU and customers in the EU to comply with that.
And what was the fee? There was the financial fee if you don't abide. Was it large?
There's a whole scale of fines.
But it's rather large.
It's pretty much strict liability, so there's really no way out of it. So you have to have procedures, so the examiners can review procedures in terms of, the cybergate, how you maintain the data, what you do with the data, what kind of consents do you receive from these individuals about data. Here we kind of have to just opt out of things, right? So I just have to check a box that, Facebook, and I'm just going to use my data.
Right.
As I mentioned earlier, I think it's really cool because it twists the perspective, puts the power in the hands of the consumer or that individual whose data, really owns their own data.
This is where, go ahead.
I'm sorry, just on my point of that, I think we should also wonder how many of the consumers would want to own their data. And I think that is going to be the really big question. I mean, I'm just curious with the group happy, how many of you would want to own their medical data? Very, very few. And I think it's initially a beautiful concept, and I feel like this is my data, I should own it. It's a lot to own your data and maintain it. And applying, I think what happens in the EU or around the world, the cultural differences in the US, we are very entitled to everything we do, and we're just trying to apply preventative health, and that has been very difficult to apply because that's mean I have to be responsible for my own health. I have to take a charge of my own health. And that's just not a concept that as a consumer in this country we're accustomed to, and I think that's where we'll find the challenge with that.
Can I just be optimistic for a second?
Please, please.
So it's not a global order, I promise. If somebody asks me, do we have a regulation for, blockchain? It's a pretty complex answer that I can give. The short answer is no. There's nothing there. This is our time to whatever we can cook it up. And in fact, we can influence. Now, let's even look at Uber, right? Airbnb. If you look at the fundamental what they have done, it's freaking illegal. Okay? Uber is supposed to be illegal because you're not supposed to grab a cab.
It's being
on
paid,
cars.
by the way.
And so is Airbnb. You look at the housing law, it's a completely, but the thing is, the people who needed it, that market did it. So I think what we are saying is, instead of kind of worrying about what the regulation may be, we can solve it. So even GDPR talking about, you need to erase it. Yeah, the initial reaction is, oh my God, if I use blockchain, there could be middle records, I can't do it. But what exactly does that mean, right? Are you a data owner? Are you a data custodian? Or are you the data users? The thing that you need to do is completely different. The response is different depending on what type of role or the data person you are. By looking at that, maybe there's something you don't want to put into blockchain. And especially even at HIPAA, I looked at every 158 questions, actually literally yesterday. Not even a single word talking about the evaluation. However, it does talk quite a bit about EPHI. And that's a pretty small type of a data record compared to massive amount of medical records we're talking about. So if you're kind of really looking at things, I believe these are really solvable, especially a place like here. It can be solved.
I agree. I think the problem, though, is that there's a fundamental lack of understanding, to the level that you and I might have, and the people in the audience, and they're the key stakeholders. So, from my perspective, we need to bridge that gap. We need to figure out, how do we help them help themselves? And clearly, by reading HIPAA or reading GDPR, they're not going to get there, right? I mean, there's treatises written on how to analyze these things. So that's the conundrum that we're facing, and that's where I think it's a failure of the governmental actors, because that's their job, is to kind of have, roundtables and meet with the industry leaders. Like Uber, for example, you're absolutely right. Uber pushed legislation, particularly in New York City, and they forced New York to change their laws with regard to hailing taxis, right? Uber did that because it had the market size, and members of that other community. So I think it's incumbent upon us to kind of push back.
The word that I heard at the last conference I went to was disintermediation. This is a term, if you stay in the blockchain space, that you will hear a lot. So disintermediation means getting rid of the third party, getting rid of the bank in terms of the crypto world, and getting rid of the EHR actually at the end of the day, so that the consumer and the patient, which we all are, has control of their data. And it can be off-chain, it can be timed where you have control of my data for the next 24 hours. So it can be that specific, and I've heard technologists talk about this, and they're working on it. So I expect you all in the audience at a place like this to come up with some of these solutions. I've already been told, which I can't believe because of course I've got 100 more questions, I've already been told we're at the 10-minute mark. So please, what questions might you have of any of the panelists out here in the audience? Yes?
I have a question for Dana. So, you talk about
We've got a microphone.
you talk about how these electronic health records have our data and they're in silos. What do they do with the data of the patients, and how do you think that they would share or would not share? Can you just talk a little bit about the culture behind these legacy societies?
Good question.
Data is money. I mean, these days, a lot of businesses we see is not about the services they're providing, is they're getting you there so they can get your data, because they can do so much with your data. We have one of the clients I know that purchased one of our competitor electronic medical record, and we were like, head to head for the longest time. But after a while, what we end up doing is just going to that client and contracting with them for their population health strategy, which is pushing everything up to the cloud. So we really no longer care about what do you have in your EMR, who are you using, it's who is carrying your cloud and all the data that coming from all the small EMR you have. There is a lot of algorithms that's been developed, and I think you can sell that to many industries of building, predicting some diseases, septic. I think a lot of the alerts that you can come up with, so you can take that data and really build on and do a lot of things with it and to benefit the industry. And some of it, I think you sit on it for the future for other potentials. But that's been my experience so far with that.
Anyone else have a question from the panelists around regulatory effect? Yes, Shah.
Yes, maybe thank you very much for the really interesting, informative discussion here. I just would like to ask, because I'm interested in electronic medical record data, what is the plan for the adoption of blockchain when it comes to, I like the term legacy community. Are they going to do it between them? Or is it going to be only at the population level? Are they going to be open maybe someday to other? Because interoperability has been the problem, a major problem for years. And when is it going to end in terms of bringing the systems together?
And I do want to have a disclaimer that I don't speak on behalf of my previous employer because I'm no longer there, but just having been in the industry for 17 years. So all these things that are actually, you know, the interoperabilities and all the things that we would like to see it happen, as I mentioned earlier, this is beyond just the limitation of the technology. There's, you know, ownership of the data and the limitation of sharing it. Big corporations are, you know, not going to jump on the latest technology. I've worked with this for so long. Every time we have a new thing fires up, everybody get really excited about, all our clients are excited about, and we just sit and pause. There are, yes, you sit and watch, and you have a few people play with it and see how it plays out. And I really think at the end of the day, it's consumers who will drive. Our clients who always pushed us to do more and better when you come from a big corporation. And that's the only reason why they will do it. And I feel the same thing about, you know, blockchain. If we do wanted to have something, a model like this where patients own the data, you really, the consumer will have to push for that. They will have to push for regulation to happen. It's going to be your responsibility to do that. So our client will push us to do, typically in big corporation. I can tell you there's always somebody in the background playing with it. But until they see a proven case, like coming up to this conference, I reach out to some of my colleagues to see what's the latest, and very skeptics, everybody's super skeptics. Nothing's been impressive out there, they will not touch it, they won't make a public statements about it. It's just the way it is. So I think that's why you want to move out of that ownership of the EMR, having that one party that's control it, and have more a community that will contribute to it. But that is cultural change that requires trust in the system and each other to update the data and grant it to each other. So I think we need to think past the EMR and what they can do. I think the EMR did a good groundwork to get things going. It is not the solution to where we ultimately want to go.
I think we also have to look at the political landscape, right? So I guess I could say Trump up here without people freaking out, but the Trump administration is the door lock. The Trump administration is not really motivated to put forth regulation. I mean, Trump's actually said publicly many times, and people in his cabinet, that they want to kind of deregulate in many ways, right? So they would only put forth a new regulation if they could kill 2 existing regulations. So think about that math. You guys will spark it back to me later. But anyway, the issue is that we're not in an environment that's pro-regulation. So the point is, the motivation we're talking about, does the motivation come from the bottom up, from the consumers, from the key stakeholders? You're probably not going to see the motivation from governmental actors.
On a final note, I'd love to say that last night I read that a Taiwanese hospital has already implemented blockchain technology as a platform in their whole hospital. So I go back to my freight train analogy to blockchain technology. It is here, it is happening, it will happen. The nooks and crannies of it being perfected, we're in the middle of that, there's no question. I would refer you to a company I'm familiar with in Charleston by the name of PocketDoc. They have 50 contracts with small EMR companies for the most part. I don't think the 2 big ones in the room. And that they have APIs with. So it is happening. They are only at a MVP POC level, about to pilot before they're in production. So look for that to happen. As you all know, and I've only been in the blockchain space about 1.5 years, but as Manny said last night, it's like dog years. It feels like forever because things are happening so quickly. But my advice, and the chamber is into this too, is education, is educating yourself. Read everything that you can, because there's a lot happening that not every conference can address or stay on top of. And I'm told I'm out of time, unfortunately, so please help me thank my distinguished panel.